we think that it's because an athlete feels internally conflicted about it, because one way he or she or the athlete has a very good bond with the coach, but on the other hand, the coach is demanding things from the athlete that the athlete doesn't know what to do with it. So the athlete doesn't want to disappoint the coach. So it's a very internal conflict.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching with myself, Mark Carroll. In today's episode, I had the pleasure of interviewing Elisa Lefever, who is a doctoral assistant at Gent University in Belgium. We discuss Elisa's recent publication, which was done in collaboration with a wider research team, looking at quite a thorny question in it within coaching quarters, and it's like whether there's a close coach athlete relationship that can be characterized, with high relatedness support, and the coach feels, that an athlete experiences a sense of care and interpersonal involvement with the coach. Does that buffer the wider controlling dynamic that might be at play there? Almost as tough love acceptable, and is it functional for helping performance, or actually does it actually exacerbate the impacts of control, because quite a close relatedness supportive relationship can almost like be weaponized against the athletes, and make sometimes the feelings of control harder to push against, and therefore we almost do things that the athlete may do to cope under that, and that's what's really interesting with Lisa's work as well, is it combines self-determination theory and coaching styles with coping, Skinner's coping frameworks, to really expand on that thought, and really interesting work, and we get the answer of that, and it's, I think, really important takeaways for coaches to consider around awareness of the various elements of coach behaviour that occur at the same time. So I really hope that you enjoy it. It's a really great paper and a really interesting conversation in this space of the coach created motivational environment. Well, I've got you. Please, if you're a new listener to the show, welcome. If you're a more committed, longer term listener, welcome back. Either way, it's really important just for the show's visibility that you can subscribe, and that you rate the show wherever it is you listen, in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Just as I say, help with the visibility. So please do that. Please also remember, at the moment, I'm taking on feedback around the show. I'm always open to feedback, but actually formally, there's an MS form, a little Microsoft form that I've attached within the about section of the show in the show notes. If you fill that in, it won't take long at all. It's really to help you understand the impact that the show has had on your practice, or even the practice of your organisation, so that I know that I've got evidence for, this is a public engagement activity to help me actually, have justification to keep doing the podcast, which I really want to do, and I do have every intention of doing. But to really have that strong back in there of knowing that it's reaching the people that I want it to reach, which is you, the coach, and also you, the coach researcher, in the same light. Please also, there's also opportunities within that form to actually get a bit of input into where the podcast might go next, and with some features that I'm thinking about bringing in as well. So just wanted to mention that. And without any further ado, let's get into the episode. So, Elisa, how are you? It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to meet you, actually. So yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, really excited to chat today about the recent publication, which was looking at whether or not a controlling coaching relationship that contains, elements of relatedness within it, of interpersonal involvement within it, where that buffers or exacerbates the controlling dynamic. And obviously, you answered that question in the work, but it's such a cool premise to a study. I think it probably touches a little bit on some cultural assumptions about, tough love and all those sorts of things. Maybe is that maybe a good point for us to start with? If you could maybe tell us a little bit about what were your actual motivations for doing this study, and how it kind of fits in with the work.
So when we look at the coaches, so we actually started from like the perspective of the coaches. And when we talk with coaches, a lot of coaches said like, but my controlling coaching style, or my direct and like quite harsh ways of behaving, it's not that bad because I'm also very related and I have a very good bond with my athletes. You can say, okay, maybe those two cancel out, but we don't know. But the coaches still use that as a way to, lessen their controlling behavior, whilst it's still, spoiler alert for my paper, it's still not the case.
Yeah. Is there a bit of a difference sometimes when I think about that, there's a big difference in my mind around like contracting with an athlete, like where, you as a coach could be very directive in some respects controlling, but I think it's a different dynamic where the athlete has had the autonomy to decide that's okay and they've contracted with the coach about how that relationship will kind of manifest. Whereas I think where this is a slightly different dynamic when we're talking about the coach who does direct, but the athlete's sense of autonomy or sense of control within that relationship has been quite, minimalized, if not totally taken away. So that seems like is that the slight difference here? Because I feel like you can have a coach led coaching process that is respectful of autonomy, but you can have ones, and I think this is where controlling coaching and recognizing there are differences between the two, where it is about the coach led and the athlete's voice is very much small in that respect. Is that the case somewhat, and maybe in the way that we might naturally see these things unfolding in reality?
Yes. Because when, as a coach, it's not because you are setting high standards that you are controlling. You can set high standards for your athletes because I think your athletes actually want to have high standards because, especially in competition and competitive sports, they want to improve themselves. And you can do that by setting high standards, giving them structure. But you can also do that by saying, oh, you have to do this, and do
Mm,
that in a very controlling way. So those are actually very two different ways of coaching. So you
yeah,
can set boundaries and structures and be direct with your athletes, but you can still do it in a motivating and structuring way by setting high standards. And
yeah.
I think there's the difference between a controlling coaching and a more motivating coach.
Yeah, I think it's so true, and I think that's what a lot of coaches maybe miss that it's not to be autonomous supportive isn't to deny structure, that it is actually highly involved. It's just not restrictive, and I think that's where sometimes coaches get their back up a little bit when we talk about the need to be autonomous supportive in a way that is helping the athlete navigate through parameters that you have set as the coach, that the coach has set as the expert, in a way it isn't stifling their sense of autonomy, and it is just, but isn't necessarily in the way of what you want, what your goals are as a coach for the athlete, and the whole and idea, and it also isn't in the way of what you know best for the athlete to be doing. So I just think it's great that you mentioned that. I think this is one of the things that stood out to me, we were obviously chatting about this as well just before we came on air, is when I was reading the work and certainly in the introduction to it, you spoke a lot about we don't really know a whole lot about the impacts of controlling coaching or even the mechanisms of controlling coaching because autonomous support does get the spotlight quite often. And that's been the case for probably quite a while. Even with one of the colleagues attached to the work Bartholomew's work and looking at the taxonomy of coach control and coach behaviour. Even back in 2009, we were talking about the fact that we don't really understand how these things play out. There's not a lot of attention given to that. Was that something you felt was quite important to address? What led you to having that interest in control in itself? Because if so many people, and I'm probably complicit with this, we all look at the autonomy side of things and we forget a little bit about how these mechanisms play out at the darker side of functioning, if you want to call it that. What does that resonate at all? What's your thoughts there?
Well, I have a personal side to the story and I have a more
Yeah,
scientific side to the
great.
story.
Personal's better. I love personal stuff.
So my personal side is I have always been a competitive swimmer. So until I went to university, now I'm a swim coach. So I train the competitive youth at my local club. And I always had a very good experience with my coach. I still think our club has a very motivating climate and I could grow as an athlete and I could be myself as an athlete. But then when I was at competitions, I saw coaches that were like yelling at their athletes, let their athletes swim when they were injured. And even as a swimmer, then I was like, that's not normal because even though it's competition, it's still a hobby,
Mm,
especially yeah, at the level I swim in. So it was still that's like the personal side of like how could this way of coaching help an athlete because I didn't really see it because I only had a good experience with my coach. And then when we look at the research side, when I started university, we learned to research about it. And then it was like, as a coach, you fluctuate a lot. So it's not that you're in general a motivating coach. You always have some bad days, some good days. And during those bad days, you can be more controlling. And then I was like, okay, that's true. But how does it impact the athlete? And then you look at the research, and a lot of research has been done on their mental health, on things like that. But on performance,
mm,
no research has been done. Whilst a lot of coaches, especially in the elite level, they say, oh, this way of coaching is necessary to get a good performance, but there's no research on it. So that's why I was like looking at different coaching styles and how it relates to different outcomes, including also performance.
Yeah. Do you know what comes through quite strongly there, Elisa? And I think this was reflected in the work. It's the athlete's perception of it. And obviously you've given a bit of an anecdote there around your own experiences of this in the past. And look, there's been a lot of work to suggest that controlling behaviours do increase in competition amongst coaches versus in training. I think there was a paper, it was Smith, and I think it was 2016 or 2017, spoke about this. And it's like, why is that happening? We know there's a lot of pressure around coaches in this, but I think what's often neglected is the athlete's voice. And we mentioned like there isn't a lot about performance, isn't it, or not? Obviously, and I would say this is in some light, it's very difficult to find. We can't really determine cause and effect. We don't necessarily know if it is having an actual impact on performance in an objective way. This is the perception of the athlete is a wee bit fallible, but it's as close as we can actually get to really recognising the impacts this has on an athlete in performance, because a coach can't. And this is why there's a lot of holes in that assumption by coaches, isn't there, that this is important for performance, because there's never really ever been any evidence to suggest that it does help. It's very, because there's so many things in between that. There's so many variables, like motivational psychology is one part of the coaching process. There's so much other stuff that's happening that we couldn't even track anyway. So all we can really do is think about what's the athlete experience. I think that's probably the most pragmatic way of ascertaining, is this justified and is this correct? And I think the fact that your paper's leaned into that is it has that, I think, that pragmatic feel to it, in that sense of what actually is mattering at the crux of things. I just think that's really cool. I think that obviously you measure quite a lot. Maybe this is maybe a good. No, actually, before we get to some of the methods, because there's another thing that you mentioned, obviously when you were younger, when you were involved as an athlete, does this start to build into perhaps why you didn't just look at this through an STD lens? You actually looked at this through Skinner's coping theory framework. Does that play a bit into that? Because you'll probably have observed other athletes being coached in this way. And maybe, I don't know if yourself or you've ever experienced this yourself, but then how we actually deal with it as an athlete, there's lots of different ways. It isn't one dimensional. Could we maybe get in? Well, firstly, does that align with how you felt? Or I don't want to presume anything. And then maybe also, can we get into maybe explaining that? How you brought in Skinner's coping framework to kind of tease this out a little bit further?
So, in all honesty, didn't really think about coping unless when I started this research. So it
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah.
really that I thought when I was an athlete, like, I don't know if I could handle this or not. It was more
Mm,
like, what are they doing? Like,
mm,
I don't understand why you do that as a coach. So not necessarily how would I react or how would the athletes, their athletes of the more controlling coaches cope with that. It just turned out to be in the research project and in the project that I was like, and then you start thinking about it and then it's like, oh yeah, but for example, you can cope in many different ways. I think I can explain it now. So you can cope in a very accommodating way, which is where a coach is very pressuring on you. You understand where the coach is coming from and you just adapt and you do what the coach says, but you understand where he's coming from.
mm.
So you're doing it with, full mindfulness and full,
Yeah, volition, yeah.
a voluntary way. I'm going to say
Mhm,
it like that.
mhm,
And that's a good way of coping. Then you also have the other side of it. So accommodation is when you see it as a positive thing, you understand the perspective of the coach. Then you also have compulsive compliance, where you just, as an athlete, just do what your coach says. You're not really agreeing with your coach, but you don't really want to go into it or go against your coach. You just do what he says or he or she says. And I think when I look back at my swimming, I think that is the most common form that the athletes use
mm.
because they were maybe scared or they just didn't have the energy to go against their coach or discuss it with their coach, that they just did what the coach told them to do.
Yeah, it's power, isn't it, really? It's like just, the coach has power through status alone, and I would probably agree. I think a lot of athletes probably just go, "Well, I don't like it, but I don't really have much choice," and you go along with that. Uh, is the danger then around yeah, yeah, sorry, Lisa, yeah, don't want to
Yeah,
carry on
but
with it.
as
Yeah,
a
yeah,
coach, even
yeah.
I myself as a coach, you want that in an athlete. Not necessarily that they blindly obey you, but you want that they listen to you, that they do their best. And you can do that in an accommodating way, but you can also do that in a compulsive complying way, that an athlete just do what they're told and they are scared to give their opinions and discuss things with you. So But as a coach, then it's nice to work with athletes who are motivated, listen to you, and that's also a thing. Also, me personally, I'm struggling with
Mm.
to yeah
And is
to be
there,
responsible athletes.
yeah, yeah. And is there also another adaptive way of regulating your behaviour, how you cope in these situations? Is it also like compromise? So there's also times where the athlete might actually come to a agreement with the coach about, I'm not necessarily fully aligning with this, but if you do this, then at least you can get on board with it volitionally, and then that sort of is somewhat good. And then there's the other opposite end of this, even more than the passive, was it actually like active rebellion, isn't it? You get that a lot as well. I don't know how often. I mean, has there been any research done that's tracked, like we're talking about what's typically the most common response or most common coping response? Has there been any research that's tracked actually the most common one? That's like empirically, I don't know. Obviously, we can still sort of acknowledge it just from our own experiences, but there hasn't been so much there. Yeah, I could see that. Is there what creates problems then? If I'm what actually makes coping adaptive versus maladaptive then? If we can maybe explain for the listener, I suppose, for how that links to motivation orientation and maybe different outcomes that have been associated with that, if it's burnout or performance. Why is there a need for athletes to voluntarily go along with controlling coaching and the way that they cope and how they find peace with that versus take on the information and take on the instruction but not actually internalize it? Why does one have a detrimental impact and one maybe less so? What's your thoughts there?
I don't think it's really has been researched in that depth, but what I would say just from reading literature and just giving my own thoughts to the literature is
Yeah,
I
yeah.
see like accommodation. So when they actually internalize the behavior of the coach and they accept it and they understand where the coach is coming from, it's giving them kind of structure and they understand the structure and they understand it and it's more the structure side, I think. Whilst
Mm.
compulsive compliance is more like the chaotic side, and they just say, I'm just gonna do it. I don't understand where he's coming from. I'm not agreeing with him, but it's so in my head, the structure is missing there.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's yeah. Yeah. No, it's an interesting thought on it actually, about how it actually what it says about how much they understand what the coach is doing. Because it's really probably about whether or not we attach credibility to the opinion, isn't it? You know, I mean, often, and this is where I wonder if coaches sometimes just shoot themselves in the foot by by neglecting to do small things, like even overlooking the importance of offering a rationale to an athlete. Because you could have an instruction. It doesn't we don't need to categorize it quite yet, but you could have an instruction which is directive. But if you just give a rationale for that instruction, the athlete is then able to have a better chance of agreeing with it, taking it on. I think it's probably coaches sometimes to be negligent of just the importance of doing that rather than just do it and don't ask me why, just do it. And that could play a big role because I think you've linked that very well to considering how does that actually help me understand what I need to do, not just how does it make me feel in control. I don't know how much athletes actually overtly care about that in the moments. I think it's ultimately how does this help my performance?
Mhm.
I probably would see that. It did make me think, but Elisa, when I was looking at it about the mechanisms, just that if we adopt the behaviour without internalizing it, I think that's what leads to these more controlled, externalized motivations to take part in the activity. Now, obviously, like a coach doing this one competition, it's still meaningful and it could still have a detrimental impact, but it's that slow burn effect. I could imagine if this is a regular dynamic within that relationship. I think that's why there has been some research in the past that's often found that when athletes have more controlled motivation because they haven't been able to internalize the reasons why they're there, and this plays a small part in that, but still a part. That's where I think longer term you get these things like burnout and things like that, isn't there? Because I'd imagine did it ever play to come back to I think the initial thing you spoke about around how coaches see this as really important for performance? Is there a bit of truth in that short term this sort of coaching does lead to results in performance sometimes, but maybe longer term that effect starts to kind of it starts to kind of get less and less, and then we start to see the opposite occurring. Have you found, or even from your own experience, or just even from the coaches that you've maybe interacted with around that, how much truth is there in that, or what's your thoughts there? I'm just curious to know.
It's a lot to unpack in your question.
I know, sorry, I have a habit doing that.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's very interesting. It's a very interesting discussion. So I think, and also my research showed that. Also, the research that I'm working on, it's a new longitudinal research where we look across games actually, and also research in parenting already showed that, or suggests that when in the beginning you can cope in an accommodating ways with a controlling coach or controlling parent, but in the long run, it will usually lead to compulsive compliance, to that not internalizing the question or like internalizing the demands of the coach or the parent.
Right, okay.
In the parenting studies, they had, to my knowledge, it's not had been researched in the sports world, but in the parenting context, they think like, oh, they will accommodate in a positive way, and that will enforce them and like give them more love because the parents are like, oh, my child listened, so I'm gonna give them positive feedback by giving them more attention or saying that they did a good job. But in the long run, the child or the athlete in this case will be like, but I don't actually agree with that. And they will just do it against their will.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, oh God, that's really interesting. So, there's almost like a pathology to this, like where at the beginning they go along with it. I could imagine that lures a lot of coaches into a false sense of security about the athlete's satisfaction within that relationship because, well, oh, they seemed okay and they seemed accommodating at the start and they haven't said anything since, but they don't necessarily know unless an athlete has verbalized it. They don't necessarily know how that's trickling off across a longer span of time. And maybe that's where problems probably are created. If it's not through compulsive compliance that becoming an issue, it might even just be the actual rejection of the behaviour and other dysfunctional elements in the relationship coming in. But then I wonder if that's where this is, and again, this comes back to I think why your work is so important is that this isn't bad coach all the time just telling them what to do. We're actually seeing a very caring, interpersonally involved coach who's rather insidiously kind of like, making an athlete feel that they want to have that bond and probably want to protect that bond in a way, while this behaviour under the surface is having a really detrimental effect along the way, isn't it? This is where it gets really complicated. I just think that's so important. It does remind me of the need to remember that coaching behaviours aren't mutually exclusive. So, like, if a coach is acting need supportive in one way, it doesn't mean that naturally then they're not need 14 in another. All these behaviours are happening all at once. I was doing I always think it's nice to almost imagine for people that are listening in, like, think about coaching behaviours almost like if you have if you're I'm not a DJ, but if you had like a music board and there's different volumes of control for each of the different songs or tracks or different, we can be putting all these different dimensions of coach behavior up, down, all different ways, and they all have interacting effects. So like that, I think that really just sets up this conversation really well. And this is what we're getting at with it. And you know what I think? And just before we go into the methods, I just need to congratulate, obviously, that I think it's so novel, actually, the fact that you have brought in the coping framework to work in partnership with self-determination theory, because I don't actually think, I think it's been a criticism of self-determination theory as a meta theory, it doesn't have a good track record for interrogating the pathologies of the sort of darker side of human functioning. It never, compared to it is at its core a positive psychology theory. So I don't think it does well on its own to talk about these other things. And I think what you've done, and I think it's really great work, is that by bringing in a sort of, not a sister theory, but like a complementary framework that helps flesh these processes out more and adds to the theory. I think it was really interesting. I think that's great. Tell us then, what did you do? Let's talk a little bit more then, Elisa, about the actual, maybe the methodology of the work and who you done it on, and discuss some of that, the thinking behind that, so that we can understand how you got to your results, and we'll chat about the outcome.
Yeah. So the research is in volleyball players. So we only questioned volleyball players in Belgium. So it's the Flemish part of Belgium, so the Dutch-speaking part, and it's all levels. So it goes up from provincial level all the way to national, and even some elite levels we also reached. Now, an important mention is that this was during the COVID period, so not every team was consistently training. So they were training, they were allowed to train, but sometimes the athletes fell out and things like that. So this is an important side note to the study. However, we did measure it, so it measured once. So it was through an online questionnaire. It was measured once around March, I think. So that means like normal season in Belgium goes from September till I think April. So it was more toward the end of the
Okay.
season, which
Is that
was,
is that quite and is that quite important actually, considering this is probably the business end of the season? And obviously it's still really important and important. We need to, but it's great that we do need to have a timestamp on these things somewhat, because that impacts the dynamic, doesn't it?
well, we did a longitudinal study, but I didn't really analyze all the data, so I can give you
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
a
yeah.
concrete answer. But when we just see coaches and just from literature, we see that a coach in the beginning of the season is he's mostly motivated and more need supportive, whilst towards the end he gets more controlling and more need thwarting.
Mhm.
Especially if there are some big competitions at the end. This also could be more pressure, which on the coach, which could then lead also to controlling coaching. So it is an interesting time to measure the controlling coaching and also the relatedness support, because if you would measure it at the beginning of the season, yeah, the relatedness with your coach could also be way less than when you trained with the coach for a whole season, basically. So those two interactions, yeah, it
Yeah, yeah.
changes. So
And
it's
it makes complete sense actually to me as well, in the sense that it's better in a way. I think it's quite. I think it leads to more interesting findings. The fact that there was a bit of a timestamp towards the end of the season, because sometimes the way studies to be set up, if we just were interested in seeing how, when pressure's up here, how does that impact the relationship? When things are hard, how does that impact the relationship? Because I think that's more useful than necessarily looking at the start of a season when conditions are favourable towards favourable dynamics. I actually think that's just another strength in that, in a lot of ways. I don't think that's necessarily a limitation or anything. We always can talk about limitations. So you measured quite a few different variables, wasn't it? So what was the thought behind, what was the different variables you measured, and what was the thoughts behind them? So like performance, perceived, how did you measure performance, anxiety, burnout, and his engagement as well? So if you maybe chat us through some of those.
So we only took questionnaire, so everything was measured through a valid
Mhm.
questionnaire.
Mhm.
Performance was measured to, well, two big questions. And the first one was, how would you rate your performance from 1 to 10? So the athletes just gave their score from the season, just in general, how is your performance? And then we also looked at how athletes perceive themselves, how they make progress during the season on tactical, technical, physical, and psychological level, so mental level. And then we also questioned how they saw that their progression was more or less than their athletes, than their teammates. So that way we measured performance. So it's completely their own perspective on their performance. And we also didn't question like how many games did you want. So we didn't do that. So it's only their own perceived performance.
That's pretty cool, actually. So I didn't initially think about that when I was in the writing. I was initially thinking it was like how they perform in competition, but actually it's more how they actually performing against themselves and how they're getting
Yeah.
better. And
Yeah.
was that a conscious decision for any reason? Like why? What made, just if you maybe expand on that? Because I think that's quite interesting. The fact that we're thinking about, well, longer term, how is this actually making that athlete feel? Because I think is it maybe the risk that if we only go to something is sort of superficial, some not even superficial, but something that is so contextualized to just competition, we might be missing out on the wider good stuff that the coach is doing for the athlete, or not. Also, as well, was that quite a deliberate thought around that?
The why we chose to use progression instead of actual harsh performance is
Yeah.
because it's very difficult to objectively measure performance. So we can ask the coach to measure the performance or to fill out the performance of the athlete, but then again, it's by the objective of the coach. So the
Yeah.
way we could measure that is by actually saying, did you win or lose the game? So that in our
Mm,
head, that's the only objective way
mm,
to measure the performance. But then again, your performance, even if you win a game, your performance could be not as good. So that is why, and also during the COVID period, yeah, some games were cancelled and things like that. So we just stuck to how the athletes perceived their own performance, because all the other questionnaires that we measured is also from the perspective of the of the athletes. I'm sorry. So
mm,
we could like bundle that,
mm.
because otherwise you have like, yeah, it's just very difficult to measure performance objectively. So
Yeah.
that's the issue. We're still struggling it with the studies I'm doing now. We're still struggling. How can we make performance as objective as possible?
No, it makes complete sense. It makes complete sense. So when it came to perceptions of like need satisfaction, was it relatedness? Were all the psychological needs accounted for, or was it quite deliberate in trying to look at relatedness, sense of relatedness, and control, and I'd imagine maybe autonomy within that, or how many of the different dimensions of behaviour did you touch on as well?
We measured everything. So we measured all the coaching styles. We did not measure the needs. So we did not measure need satisfaction or need frustration. We did not do that. But in this study, we only focused on controlling coaching and relatedness support and how those interact. And the reason for that is because, in literature, you see that a positive coaching style or a more motivating coaching style, can it buffer a more demotivating coaching style, or does it even worsen? So that is what the hypothesis is true. So that's why we only looked at those two. But in the data set, we measured everything and we found the normal correlations. I only did correlations. So we found the normal things such as more motivating styles led to more positive outcomes and the other way around.
Oh, okay. No, great. And no, and thanks for correcting me on that actually. So yeah, because it was actually went to the extent of saying need satisfaction, it was more coaching styles than
Okay.
so could you explain this for and you'll need to dumb this down for someone like me who's a qualitative researcher because all the modelling fit stuff goes out over my head sometimes. So did you essentially, from what I'd gleaned, did you essentially like put lots of different hypotheses or different sort of correlations that you expected to see and then sort of measured for fit to models? To sort of like, can you talk us through how did you actually you collected all these insights? How did you then go through this sort of correlational stuff of seeing how much different models fit with your presumptions about what was going to occur? Or was it built on a hypothesis? Did you go in thinking that we expect relatedness support to buffer or we expect it to? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So we actually did the research to look at controlling coaching and relatedness support. So that was the main idea from the beginning. Because we saw from like quite old studies now in parenting again that this was actually that a controlling coaching style combined with a high parenting style now combined with a high relatedness parent with a good bond, it exacerbates and it's detrimental effect of controlling coaching over controlling parenting. Sorry, I'm constantly confusing.
I know. Yeah.
um, and it actually led then in that study to worse math results. So their scores on their math exams, it was lower. And then those studies combined with then what we hear from the coach world, so from the coaches themselves, that a controlling style is not that bad because I have a very good bond with my athletes, so they understand where I'm coming from. Yeah, we were like, there's something here, and
Yeah,
we
so
need to
you
research
had
it.
you had a bit of an inclination, but it was
Yeah,
still somewhat exploratory to see how this
yeah,
actually worked in a coaching world versus a parent one.
yeah.
Then I know we've kind of let the cat out of the bag already, but then what actually did the results show? Then talk us through some of the key findings and what you found quite useful to the conversation.
Well, when we just look at the direct effects, so when we look at the effects of controlling coaching style, we found mostly negative effects. So that a controlling coaching style relates to more feelings of anxiety, more feelings of burnout, and also to a worse performance. So in my head, this is a very important finding that we actually can say, even though it's just one study now, that a controlling coaching style leads to or relates to a lower performance. Or in this case, it's more like the progression that the athletes feel that they don't progress as much.
And is that quite and see if you can pause there because there's something I was want to talk about on that. And I think this is what's pretty cool. Now I hope I might be assuming things about what the data's telling me here, and you can tell me, but we can speculate on some of it. There's always inferences that we can take. But it's interesting because you measured both perceived performance insofar as like progression, how we actually getting better, alongside anxiety. I feel like you're taking away that's just for coaches there to then say, well, anxiety is good. To remember, there's that sort of psychology thought of anxiety in a U curve, and anxiety, we need a bit of anxiety for performance. But the fact that you've probably been able to see in the data that there's heightened performance anxiety, but also they aren't actually feeling like they're getting better. That actually further removes, maybe for anyone that's listening, that's saying, well, you need a wee bit of anxiety. Well, we're actually, it's in the results, it seems like we're actually not disproving, but we're showing how the bad anxiety is there and not the good anxiety. Is that, am I reading things that aren't there, or are you even just interested to chat about? I just think that's...
I just wouldn't call it good anxiety. I more would call it good stress.
Yeah.
Or like
Okay.
a heightened state of stress, a bit like, I have a bit nerves, but it's still fine to perform, and you can, like, your body isn't affected by it. Whilst the competitive anxiety that we measured, it was like cognitive anxiety, which was more like I feel that it won't work, and like more like that. Whilst also somatic anxiety, where it's like, oh, my stomach hurts and my body is very stressed and I'm very heightened. So those two combined, we use those two combinations for competitive anxiety. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the competition anxiety that we measured, it doesn't measure the good anxiety, like you said, or the good stress, because it's, in my head, something completely different.
But it does seem to still allude to the idea of, like, if I don't feel like something's going to go well, or I also am getting like literally like feelings of nerves and all these other things, but not in a way that seems conducive. Like, there's a difference between having butterflies and having butterflies information, like in a way that's directed towards. It still does seem, it's something still stands out for me there about what that's telling us about the athlete's experience there, that I just feels quite important, and I feel like that's really interesting. And then you also, I suppose, that was the direct effects. What was the idea with burnout? So see, with burnout, I seen, was there a direct relationship with the controlling coaching, and was it propensity towards burnout, or were you actually measuring attrition rates when we were talking about, like, there's burnout and then there's actually not participating anymore? Were we more talking about burnout in terms of like emotional exhaustion and that sort of burnout?
Yeah, it's more emotional exhaustion. So the questionnaire was more like, I feel exhausted to practice my sport, or I'm tired of practicing my sport, or after I practice my sport, I feel very tired. And it also was like on a physical level, and also tapped a bit on just the mental level of just being tired of your sport, or in this case, the volleyball. That was the ways of burnout. And also controlling coaching style led to more burnout, or related to more burnout. So that's what we also found in direct relationships.
And it's only so long. I mean, other work's obviously shown that it's only so long that an athlete can feel that emotional exhaustion before they either stop participating, or they continue to participate, but in a way that's just really bad, and they almost eat themselves alive. And then we see outcomes related to depression and a lot of different things. And does
Yeah.
that have any special relevance, considering the context of the athletes that you question, that the questionnaires were sent to? Because were they performance athletes, or were they more, was it a wider catchment of athletes, but somewhere in a performance sphere? Or perhaps they're looking towards trying to have a career in sport. Does this have any, what was interesting or meaningful to you about results based on who the sample were, insofar as the direct impacts that you've seen?
In general, well, maybe to touch more upon why we also measured burnout and performance, is because you have, at every athlete, you have a mental aspect and you have a performance aspect. And you can be mentally not good, but still perform well. And you can be mentally good and also not perform well, or the other way around. So that's why we looked at all the aspects to get a complete framework, because research also shows that in a long period of time, when athletes don't feel their best, and when they have a lot of anxiety or they've experienced burnout, it will eventually lead to a lower performance. That's why we wanted to take everything into account as for outcomes. And when looking at the sample in general, it doesn't really was a difference when high elite or high level athletes did not necessarily experience more or less anxiety than lower playing athletes or lower level athletes. So in general, it was, everywhere it was,
Oh, okay,
as you would
interesting.
expect.
Yeah. It makes me, and I know I'm just speculating here, but it makes me think about how they control in relationships. What's the tendency for them, and across different levels of sport, and also what's almost like the underpinning reason for them across different levels. Because I would always assume sometimes where I'm not, maybe I shouldn't assume this, because like if you've got an athlete who's working towards being maybe a professional athlete as such? They're so invested in it. Do they want to have more input, or actually they're more conditioned by their environment to go along with the experts that are in front of them versus the more recreational sports sometimes lead itself to? Actually, no, I think your initial story tells you that even when athletes are competing recreationally, we still see these behaviours playing out that you just don't understand why they're happening. But it's just, yeah, it makes you want to think about that, about how these, and obviously look, you can never touch on all these things at once in any one study, but it's just making me consider how context can impact these things, or maybe it's maybe a point for the listeners that are tuning in just to reflect on how their environment impacts their behaviour. I always think that's really important because we're getting information on behavioural tendencies and impacts in studies like yours, but then I always think it needs to be balanced out with understanding, well, why are they occurring in the first place? We're looking at symptoms here, but how can we also think about and reflect on that as a coach with the causes in mind as well? And it's just something that pops out of my head. But yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I'm asking you to answer questions that aren't in the work, but it's just, yeah,
When
curious
I
to know your
look at
thoughts.
when I look at my own experience and as a coach now, I have a team of athletes, and some are very young, some are somewhat older. But in the beginning, that's the feeling I have for the last 5 years that I've been coaching. In the beginning, when they come to me, they seek that direction. So they seek, like, okay, what I have to do now, the explanation for everything. They seek that. Whilst they are older and they swam more years with me, they already know that explanation, and they are way more dependent or independent, at least. So okay, they can put out their own tracks and their own goals. But then when something happens from the outside, something happens in school, and they feel anxious or get burnout from that, as a coach, it's very difficult because you want to help the athletes because, yeah, you still have a bond, or at least I have, I think, a good bond with my athletes, and you want to help them. But yeah, at the end, it's still, yeah, their decision to, yeah, talk through it and seek your guidance if they wanted to or not. And that's, for me, as a coach, sometimes quite difficult.
Oh, because in some respect, I often think I never think these studies aren't always about trying to hit coaches over the head to tell them about what they should do. But what I do think they offer is a warning sign for where I think coaches fail to check in on how much they're meeting athletes' needs, because I think there's really well intended coaches out there who are just directive, and they've maybe been given signs, or at least not signs, that of athletes not wanting that relationship. I think like athletes should speak up, but equally, depending on the athlete, it's very difficult to do so. So that's where it does go back on the coach, where we're not saying that coaches are entirely guilty and that they can't read athletes' minds, but they can initiate conversations to check in on how on and how much athletes' needs are actually being met. And I think that's the issue, is that they'll be checking in enough. And I think when you mentioned earlier on is almost the pathology, where maybe athletes are accommodating controlling behaviour to start with, but we do see over time where that might become more what compulsive compliance, or even indeed, opposition, where we're actually then moving towards a space where a workable but struggling relationship becomes a dysfunctional relationship over time, and there's things coaches could be doing to check in on that. But yeah, I know I digress, but it's really, I think that is important to discuss. Obviously, what we have it now, what we can move on to chat about is the mechanisms that you then found. So you found there was a direct relationship between controlling coaching behaviours and what reduced performance and more competitive anxiety and burnout. But there was the indirect mediator in that, wasn't there? And that's where the compulsive compliance was coming in. So you do a better job than me of discussing that, Eliza.
Yeah, so I will try to explain it in a very practical way. So when you are, as a coach, controlling, my study shows that it also related to a lower performance, to more anxiety and burnout. So there's a direct way, but you also have another way around it. So that means that when you're, as a coach, controlling, that an athlete will cope more through compulsive compliance, so that he or she will just blindly obey you because you are controlling coaching, or you're doing a controlling coaching style. And then that, by athletes coping through more compulsive compliance, that leads to a lower performance and more feelings of anxiety. So,
Mm,
and the way that, yeah, that works is just because, yeah, when you're a controlling coach, see, that's what we discussed at the beginning. You see, oh, you can accommodate it. So you can, like, internally see, oh, he does it this way, or I understand why he does it. But you can also just blindly obey your coach. And we see that also controlling coaching, that's maybe also interesting, is actually related to also more accommodation. So athletes can also accommodate in a positive way with a controlling coach, but it doesn't lead to any of the outcomes. So it just kind of stops there. And that's again why we think that in the long run, the pathway from controlling coaching to compulsive compliance and the outcomes will like more a lower performance and more burnout and anxiety. That pathway is more likely to happen than an athlete coping positively with it and internalizing the demands and understanding why the coach is controlling. So
Yeah. And then you throw high levels of perceived relatedness into the mix, and then tell us about then what you found there. So let's talk a little bit about that as an
yeah.
indirect consequence.
So when we then throw indeed relatedness support in it, we saw that when a coach was both high control and highly supportive, athletes cope more through compulsive compliance, which in turn then leads to a lower performance and more feelings of anxiety. So again, even the buffering of the relatedness support, it doesn't work. It actually exacerbates the detrimental effects of a controlling coach, because athletes who have a coach that is both controlling and both relatedness supportive will use more maladaptive coping strategies, which in turn will lead to negative outcomes. And we think that is because an athlete feels internally conflicted about it, because one way he or she or the athlete has a very good bond with the coach, but on the other hand, the coach is demanding things from the athlete that the athlete doesn't know what to do with it. So the athlete doesn't want to disappoint the coach. So it's a very internal conflict. Yeah. Where
I
they then
know.
compulsively comply.
Yeah, and it makes me really excited, and I hope you continue to do work in this space, because exactly what we're saying there, like we're inferring now about how that how the athlete's been feeling in those moments. But obviously, we haven't quite got that data yet to look kind of qualitatively expand on that. But it'd be such an interesting study. I think from experience, we can make some assumptions about what is happening there. And it's just that, yeah, and it's such a shame, because it's like it is weaponized, and I think going back to the start, it weaponizes something that's really intimate about a coach athlete relationship, and often like the thing that should unlock more doors than what it should. You know, it should solve more problems being very close with your athletes than it creates. But actually, like with small things like this, we show that actually we need to be very mindful of just respecting autonomy still within that. I would even wonder in terms of how that would even link up to then, right? So we know that the athlete isn't accommodating this correctly. I would even like to know then about how they are how that manifests then in their perceptions of competence, or their perceptions. But obviously we are seeing it to an extent. I suppose you can infer, if we feel that we're getting better, we can probably infer that we feel competent, in the same way we could probably infer if we have anxiety or good stress, as you put it, that we can infer we have confidence, and that kind of goes hand in hand with competence. But it makes me think about that NIT study, and maybe is this maybe without necessarily, I know you're still in the middle of that work, Eliza, but where could this work go next? Because I feel like you've opened up, a lot of interesting new questions out of this research. So what would you like to do next in this work, and or where do you think it needs to go next to help us understand?
Well, as you mentioned, it's and that's a bit the thing, I think, of the difficulty of social science. There's a lot of things that influence each other,
Mm.
and a lot of things that happen simultaneously, and it's a very difficult and yet interesting topic to study. And like you said, some qualitative interviews with athletes or and coaches even too, it could open up the whole narrative about what we now see quantitatively.
Mhm. Mm.
In terms of how we want to go into my next research, we did a longitudinal study where we also wanted to look at controlling coaching, relatedness supportive coaching, how this relates to the coping in general, and then also the outcomes.
Mhm.
And here I can share that we found that during consecutive games, so it's also in volleyball, in consecutive games, that when a coach is more controlling in a game, next game, their athletes will use more compulsive compliance, which in turn will lead to more anxiety during the next game. So there's also like a pathway that is
Right.
happening longitudinal. We did not really look yet at how relatedness support is thrown into that, because I'm in the middle of the data analysis, so I
Mhm.
cannot tell you
Mhm.
anything about that. But that pathway is already very interesting
Mm. Mhm.
because it's also happening longitudinally and over time.
Yeah. Oh, jeez. I know. Makes you wonder as well. I know we're just chatting here now around how this work to shape in future contexts as well. Like even the fact that this is in a team setting.
Mhm.
I would be interested to know like what an individual sport, how this outlook works there, because I know often you might be familiar with like a lot of like I've interviewed Sophia Duet recently on the podcast, and an episode soon to come out. Put a lot of her research looking at like the three C's plus one with like closeness and connection and stuff like that. That's often found that individual sports, there's a lot more of an intimate relationship often there versus like shared relation splitting closeness amongst teammates. So yeah, you do often find that you find higher perceptions of relatedness in those individual sport dynamics. So does that make it even worse? So like again, I'm thinking about where this work might go next.
It's
Dynamic be even worse, and I know we're
yeah.
speculating, but it shows where there's loads of avenues that this could go down next.
We are also doing a longitudinal research again this sports season that is almost finished now, that we almost will finish, where we look at all sports, so team sports and also individual sports
Oh,
too.
great,
So
great.
hopefully I can share some
Aye,
extra news.
yeah.
But it's indeed like it seems logic that when you only have your coach and it's a very one-on-one relationship, that
Mhm.
relationship with the coach is has a larger impact than when you're in a team sport and
Mm,
you have your teammates and you have your coach. So it
mm.
seems logic indeed that there could be again other
Yeah.
influences.
Uh-huh. And obviously we're still to confirm that, but even for people that are listening who do coach individual sport, it's a wee bit of just food for thought. Just think about it. You never know how that manifests. What would you say that, and I think I'll need to definitely try and bother you down the line, Elisa, to tell us how some of this other works went. What would you say then to help us to round it up? What are some of the practical takeaways then you think from the work? Maybe to summarise what we've kind of went over so far in terms of maybe how coaches should handle relationships, how coaches that are listening to how we could take this knowledge forward. What would you summarise that?
Well, in generally, I would just say like realize that as a coach, you fluctuate through styles. That it's you can in general be a motivating style, but when you have bad days, as I said in the podcast already, it can be that you are more controlling. But it's important that you realize that there are effects of that controlling coaching. Even when you're in general related and supportive, that controlling style can still lead to detrimental impacts on your athlete. So try to minimize it as much as possible. And instead of being controlling, try to do it more structuring. Give them guidance, set out a plan with them, explain why you're doing things. And when they go against you, try not to really see it as a negative thing. But again, try to explain why your decisions take into account their. I have that with my swimmers, like when they have dryland training, they are like, oh, it's again the same old boring exercises. And then I have to say,
Yeah.
well, it's very good for you. It trains these muscles. But then I also give them the opportunity to say, like, oh, if you have a fun way of doing it, please say it to me. And then I have also implemented some games that they suggested.
Mhm. Mhm.
And for me, as I have, this is like completely out of now the research field. For me personally, as a coach, you feel that the athletes are invested, and
Yeah.
also the athletes feel that you as a coach are invested, and they are like, oh, I can actually suggest something. I don't do anything, everything. I don't take all their suggestions because otherwise we would not train anymore.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
just sometimes like open up the conversation, I think, with the athletes. And like you said, just ask your athletes like, okay, how do you experience it? Or just maybe reflect on yourself like, okay, this training, how is my style? Am I direct by controlling or am I direct by structuring? Because those are two different things.
Yeah, no, 100%. Completely agree. Because and I think what you say is coaching is ultimately people management, and I don't think this work should be interpreted in terms of the findings should be interpreted that controlling just we need to avoid at all costs because look at how these other things mix in with it. Sometimes coaches need to do things that athletes don't want. But I think like it's the subtle ways that we can manage that, like what you've said, but just acknowledging their thoughts and perspectives, so that if it doesn't improve need satisfaction, what we have found is that it at least doesn't worsen it dramatically, at least not in the more significant way that it might over a shorter period of time otherwise do. That is it. And it's complicated, I don't think, and I think it's quite right that you've really commend you and, your team obviously for how you have bracketed what we're looking at here. It's just about showing mechanisms, not necessarily, I think, directing what needs to be done, because you've said it yourself, like it's a social practice, relational coaching, it's so complicated, but it just has a healthy balance of that. And I've seen that in the way that the work was written, and I think it's really well, just a really great study because of how it touches on those things. And do you know what? There was even a paper, the last paper I got seen, that I think said a little bit about these warning signs about not just not being controlling, but actively being supportive. I think it was a paper like Appleton, it was 2016, but it was like it was tracking coach behavior, and it was showing even in contexts that are high end need support behavior, where there's a prevalence of need 40 behavior, there are still damaging impacts. Now, they aren't damaging impacts. What this fleshes that out further is, I think, to say that it's not to say that we can avoid them being there, but just we have to be aware all the time that
Yeah.
this is what it's about. And this is the fact that this work is almost like building on the idea of how we can have one behavior that's need supportive and another behavior that's need 14 interacting together. We can't avoid these complexities. It's human relationships, but it's just awareness and then thinking how we can check in. So honestly, it's really good work, and I think it's really practical. I think that's what's really cool about it, even if it allows for a lot of these other conversations to happen alongside it, Eliza. So thank you so much for discussing it. Is there anything that we haven't spoken about that you would like to before we wrap up? Do you feel we've covered everything?
I don't really think so. Just think like
Yeah.
from a research perspective, it's important to give coaches like concrete ideas. Like you cannot just say to a coach, oh, you cannot be controlling, because then a coach is like, yeah, okay, but what do you mean? So that's why I'm like, give them more structure, give them guidance. So that's, yeah, a way to still be structuring and still get your athletes to where you want them to be, but on a more motivating way. And
Yeah.
that, I think, also as a coach, when you realize that you're like, I am quite controlling, that you find ways, you can try it yourself, you can ask your athletes, you can ask your coaches, you can look it up in the literature. I mean, there's many ways, but that you have those ways to counteract it, because that's important to not only not be controlling, but also be the opposite and be
Mhm.
a structuring coach. So that's something I hope I gave some tips and tricks here and there
Well,
to yeah,
on that,
help coaches
Elisa,
do that.
yeah. Well, on that, Lisa, then is this actually? It's a great point. Is this then actually about? I think we need to be clearer about how we differentiate structure from control, isn't it? Controlling isn't just telling an athlete what to do. That
Yeah.
telling an athlete what to do is part of what coaching is. You're setting clear expectations and you're giving instructions. But controlling isn't that. Controlling is, diminishing the view of the athlete. Controlling is commanding they must do something, like, but
Yeah.
in a way that has like quite probably more in how it's received and the sort of verbal communication of that message. It probably goes alongside quite a stern authoritarian way in which we impart the message. Control is leading through fear of punishment. Controlling is having, really overt control as to what the athlete's doing, sort of invasive supervision of what they're doing. That's controlling. And most coaches aren't doing that. I don't think most coaches probably aren't seeping into that very naturally. I think a lot of coaches are probably being more structured than they are controlling, but maybe there's outbursts or maybe there's pressure that can
Yeah.
incrementally bring that in. But I just think that's useful to just make coaches not feel bad about coaching, because I think that's where the lines are too
Yeah.
blurred
Yeah. Yeah.
sometimes,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so yeah, honestly, no, it's great. It's great. No, thank you so much, Elisa, and thank you to the listeners. Hopefully that has been every bit as useful to you as it certainly has been for me, and we will see you next time. Thank you, Lily.
Thank you.